As I think you'll know, Jumpa Sherap had actually requested I give LAM.RIM teachings on Tuesdays. And my first reaction was, I don't know, I'm too busy, how could I do that? But I thought about it and it made a lot of sense. I don't think we've actually ever done this in the house. I've been in the house now for 17 years, and I don't think we've ever actually had a senior monk give teachings to the house, which maybe is a good thing for us to start doing. The Tibetan house groups, I think a lot of them are quite focused on the debate program, so they don't have teachings, but certainly the Petigans occasionally are requested to give teachings, and so if there's a Petigan in a particular house group, they might request that, and that's how it usually starts with these things. Like sometimes Khentsur Rinpoche, the two Khentsur Rinpoches, they both give teachings, and it just starts with somebody requesting it. It's not like they organize it all ahead of time. It just starts slowly, and more people come. So I think it's a really good thing for the house to do. And also it's just good for us to have the chance to study the LAM.RIM a bit. And I thought of it more like petty, that it's like going through the text and explaining the Tibetan and so forth, but it's also good if we integrate like how to practice it and talk about that. It doesn't just have to be about learning Tibetan. It's not the only reason we're here. So to give a brief introduction to LAM.RIM, maybe some of you know, right? It's quite an interesting thing. The Tibetans really codified the Indian system a lot more than the Indians did, as far as I can tell. Both in terms of LAM.RIM, but also, as you'll see with the textbooks, when you study them and then you try to read the Indian source texts, there's quite a difference in the level of clarity and standardization. So it's usually said that this tradition of LAM.RIM started with Atisha. That's why the whole LAM.RIM itself starts with Atisha, explanations of him. So Atisha came to Tibet in the 11th century, was invited by Lama Yeshe and his son Changjub to help revive after Tibet had been in a dark age, some of you might know, after Langdharma was only king for a few years, but he was not very supportive of Buddhism, it sounds like, so they had gone through a bit of a recession, the Buddhist teachings, and then after Langdharma was assassinated, then the Tibetan Empire, which was actually quite powerful force in Central Asia, collapsed around the same time as the Tang dynasty, so maybe there's some relation. But after that, then Tibet was in a dark age, so meaning we don't really know much about what happened because there was no central government and no records were really being kept. So after that was slowly ending, then they invited Atisha to Tibet because it said that there was all kinds of wrong views. I think maybe it's a little bit akin to Buddhism in the West today. When we hear about, there was Sutra teachings and there was Tantra teachings, but people didn't know how to integrate them. The ones, like there was the Eastern Vinaya monks, there were these monks in Eastern Tibet who were practicing the Vinaya and trying to keep the Vinaya, but they didn't have much emphasis on Tantra, and then I don't even know if they had Tantra teachings there. And then there was other teachers. I'm not saying these weren't qualified teachers, like there was ones like Drokmi, one of the forefathers of the Sakya, who was teaching in central Tibet, and very, the Sakyas consider him one of their lineage lamas, but not in a monastic manifestation, very much tantric, in the classical sense of kind of crazy wisdom tantric teacher. So there were qualified teachers like that, but also there was supposedly all kinds of wrong views of people who would get extreme about it and practice tantra without any basis in the sutra teachings, and then people practicing sutra and then rejecting tantra. So we have that a bit in the West now. We've got not quite the same thing, but we've got, for example, like secular Buddhists who then reject the teachings on karma and reincarnation, and then other movements that kind of embrace things in a very not very critical manner, and then tantric groups Tantra now. Some of you might know. In the West, it would be called Tantra. It's kind of a mix of a bunch of things, and it has about 100 years history. That's quite interesting in and of itself. But it's not really based on Buddhist Tantra per se, and it's not really based on Hindu Tantra either. It's based on some gurus, some Westerners who were proclaiming themselves as gurus in the early part of the 20th century. So there's been a lot of spread of these kind of things, and people have a lot of ideas about spirituality that it's not such a strong thing in our culture, so people don't really know how to distinguish a good teacher from a bad one, or a good teaching from a bad one. So maybe we can see it as a little bit analogous in the way it is to the way Tibet was then. So then Atisha came to Tibet with the purpose of helping to integrate all the different strands that were there and to bring more clarity to the teachings. So it said that the first thing he did, he recognized that the traditional teachings weren't going to work because people didn't understand how they all fit together. So they asked him to compose a text that would help them to understand that. So he composed the LAM.RIM.CHEN.MO. Was it the Bodhi Pradi? Maybe you know? Bodhi? Pradipa. Yeah. Pradipa. Yeah, lamp to the path, right? So, only I think about 12-page text, but it was very clearly outlined in the stages how these different stages of the path fit together. And it said that when his Naden, his teacher in India, because although he was a very respected teacher, he still had a strong relationship with his own abbot at the monastery, who told him when you go to Tibet, you only stay 3 years and then you come back. But when he sent back a copy of the text, then the abbot said, "Wow, this text is so extraordinary. If there's so much benefit in your being there, maybe it's okay that you stay there." So he stayed there the rest of his life. So what was unusual about this text was the way that it made it clear how these different parts of the teachings fit into a stepwise manner. So this is considered, sometimes say in Tibetan, Jingdai Zolche, right? The trailblazer. We don't call him one of the Jingdai Zolche. Jingdai Zolche or Nagarjuna and Sangha, but in his own way, he was a Jingdai Zolche in terms of the LAM.RIM teachings and codifying it this way. So then, as a result of that, over generations, there was his students who became the Kadam lineage, Drom Tompa, and then his students. They gradually integrated these, and after a couple hundred years, or even I guess 100 years, it would have been the 12th century. So there was a teacher named Moklo Tsawa, Moklo Denshera, who was one of the translators. He translated Ngondo Gyen, Abhisamalam Kara, and other texts. And he wrote a text called the Tenrim, the Sages of the Teachings. That's not, I'll get to that in a minute. It's not quite that one. So that was kind of, making it more extensive. The Atisha's text was very condensed. And then his student, Gelong, he wrote this text, Enlightenment, the great stages of the teachings. So it's sort of a precursor to the LAM.RIM.CHEN.MO. And Tsongkhapa, at one point in his career, there's the story of him receiving being at the monastery when they received this text. They came out with the horses and everything and received it in a very formal manner. And he was quite impressed and was interested in perhaps writing something similar. So this Tsongkhapa was quite a bit later, of course. Tsongkhapa was the 14th century, so that would have been 400 years after Atisha. Which, looking back, we say 10th century, 14th or 11th century, 14th century, and it doesn't sound that different, but it's like, think about the 18th century to now, or 17th century to now. It's quite a while before that. So Tsongkhapa, I'm sure most of you know a lot of the points of his biography. One is that at a young age, he had a vision of Atisha, who had a vision, and then Atisha merged with him. He had a lot of visions. He had visions of all kinds of things. As we're studying Tukken this year. The Tukken is 18th century Tibetan Tuken Chukinima. And at one point he says, he's just giving a look, because he gives quite a long, extensive exposition about Tsongkhapa's life. This is in his history, or his Tuken Drupta, it's called. It's not history per se, but it's a compendium of all the different styles of practice of Buddhism and other religions that were extant in Asia at that time. So when he's talking about Tsongkhapa, at one point he says, I'm just giving a very brief picture of some of the experiences he had. If you wanted to document every single experience he had in meditation over all the years of his life, then it would fill volumes. So every day he was having these kind of things. But one of the ones that's quite well known is this story of it. I think at age 7 he had a vision of Atisha, and also at that same time of what's it? Chakdor Tun. Is it Tun? Yeah, there's this fierce Vajrapani. It's often translated. So there's one aspect of Vajrapani. He had a vision of him. Throughout his career, then Tsongkhapa, he went. Of course, he went to central Tibet when he was 7. He was still over there in Amdo, right near where His Holiness was born. But he came to central Tibet and studied there, and then he composed several texts when he was young, which we study here. So his first text was Loso Drope Temke, which is about the 20 Sangha, which we don't study directly here at Sera, but when you study Ginna Niju in the 7th year of the program, you can read that. Actually, there's some questions on the exam about it, even though you haven't read it, so it's good to read it anyway. It's quite a text for someone who was 22 years old. And then when he was 23, he composed his commentary on Kunchi, the Alaya Vedana, for the Chittamatra, all-ground consciousness, which we do study here, actually, as the main textbook in the 8th year of the program. It's quite extraordinary, again, for somebody who's 23. And I read a book a few years ago we have in the library called Living Yogacara. It's very nice. It's a book it's a translation of a book by a Japanese abbot who's one of the few Chittamatras today. In Japan, they still have some. But the translator was American, I believe, and he was talking in the suggestions for further reading at the end. He mentioned several things, and he said, if you read Tibetan, then Tsongkhapa's commentary on the Alaya Vedana is probably the best commentary in any language. So this was when he was 23, and he was not living in a Chittamatra country. And there is this in China and Japan. It was much more extent. But anyway, we say, showing the aspect of interest in the Chittamatra view. Although it says at the end of the text, there's his dedication verses, and he says something like, "This is my feeling about how things are, but I'm not sure. So you have to check for yourself," which is quite different when later in his life, like when he composed Trangi Lekshe Ningpo at the very beginning. He says that there were all these great Tibetans in the past. And he doesn't give them by name. He hardly ever does that, but he refers to like Buton and Ngoklo Sawa, and he says, but they failed to understand, and through the kindness of Manjushri, I have understood. So he's pretty straight about it. He doesn't say it quite those words, but that's basically the point. I think sometimes it's understood that he says that maybe they realized it personally, but the explanation wasn't clear. So he definitely felt at a certain point. Actually, it said, so when he was 41, Tsongkhapa, after having practiced many years. I should also mention, one other text is Sercheng. That's a bit exceptional too. Lekshe Sercheng, which he composed, I think, when he was 31, he finished it. It took about 2 years to write it, which is not very long, considering that we take 7 years to study it. So this is what the main text we use for Parchen is Sercheng. Which also it is said to present kind of his early view. It's got quite a few things that we don't accept in the Gelong school, and it's of course based in the Ranggyupa, the Svatantrika system, and he also his presentation of it, like he says continuously through the text, he mentions the Alaya Vedana, the all-ground consciousness, which according to Gelong is not something that's accepted by the Svatantrika. So we explain it by saying, well, he was saying that because his teachers, like Nyapon and Rendawa, they accepted it, and he was still a student of them. He didn't want to offend them. So whether that's true, I don't know. But that's how we justify that he comments on that in that text. But that text was made him very famous. That's why they say it's so hard to read, because he was trying to establish himself as a scholar. So he wrote in a very ornate, sort of Baroque language that impressed a lot of people, but it makes it quite difficult to understand a lot of the passages. As a side note, my teacher and Jingzhou's teacher, Chöden Rinpoche, actually he memorized Lectio Sertrang. I've never heard of anybody doing that recently, but it's 1,200 pages and quite big and difficult. So this is what people did in Tibet, but I haven't heard of anyone doing that in recent years. So when Tsongkhapa was 41, then actually when he was 36, then he had a vision of Manjushri. Well, that was a long-going thing also. They don't get too complicated with this, but he had been having experiences of Manjushri even as a young boy. There's that story of him as he looked, he looked into some kind of round circular thing, and then he saw a vision of Manjushri amidst the blue flames, things like that. But it was later when he was in his 30s, he met Lama Umapa. Again, I don't know how many of you know this story, but this was when he was staying in Sang, in western Tibet, and there was this yogi nearby in a cave, and someone told him about him. He went to meet him. This Lama Umapa, he had never had any real formal education. He was a cowherd, and when he wanted to meet Tsongkhapa, actually, and he invited him. He requested him for teachings because he said he asked him for the Sarasvati empowerment, which is the female Buddha of wisdom, and he explained to Tsongkhapa that he'd been having these visions of Manjushri since a young age. It had happened when he was a cowherd. He started seeing Manjushri, who was talking to him and instructing him. And he wanted to ask, is this authentic? I don't really know if these are authentic. So Tsongkhapa said, well, we'll try. I'm going to ask you some questions, like usually he was medium, and we'll see if I'm going to ask some questions, and I'll judge by his answers whether it's really Manjushri. And he was convinced by the answers that it was. So for a couple of years, Tsongkhapa spent a lot of time with Lama Umapa, and was Lama Umapa basically acting as a medium for Tsongkhapa to receive teachings from Manjushri. And it was a two-way thing, that Tsongkhapa also gave him a number of empowerments and teachings. And gradually Tsongkhapa, it seems, developed the ability to see Manjushri without the help of a medium. But and in one of the last sessions he had with Lama Umapa, then he asked, Manjushri told him it's time to go and do retreat. And he was saying, well, I've been teaching, it seems to be very beneficial. And Manjushri said, it's not really that much benefit in your teaching until you have realization. And so you need to go to retreat. So that's when he was 36, he went into retreat. And for about 5 years, doing a lot of very serious practice with the Dakpa Gye, so the 8 pure disciples. One of them was Tokden Jampa Gyatso, which again was, in terms of his students, there was of course Kedrip-je and Gyaltsab-je are the most well known because they composed a lot. Tokden didn't compose that much, but he was the only one to whom Tsongkhapa said to have given the Mahamudra transmission, and he had a lot of mystical experiences himself. And I think at some point Tsongkhapa even asked him to check something with Manjushri. It was like they both saw Manjushri, and Tokden sometimes had different experiences of him. Anyway, so at age 41, when they were staying in Ulka, then Tsongkhapa finally had a realization of emptiness, he says in his biography. Again, maybe all of you know this, so didn't tell me if I need to stop. But he had the dream one night because he'd been praying for a long time to have experience. And that's also important. Manjushri told him before he went into retreat, he said 3 things. He said, you need to study the great texts very thoroughly, and you need to make single-pointed request to the Lama, and you need to accumulate merit and purify, to do a lot of accumulation and purification. So he did millions of prostrations and mandala offerings in retreat along with his students. So finally, when he was 41, he had this dream of Nagarjuna, along with, he said, that 5 students, although there's some dispute about who those 5 students are. But the general presentation is it was Nagarjuna, 4 students, but 5 total. So along with Arya Deva, and then Buddha Palita, and then Bhavaviveka and Chandrakirti were debating with each other, because they both debated about the meaning, about whether Buddha Palita was right or not. But then Buddha Palita came to Tsongkhapa in the dream, and then put text on his head, and it was the root wisdom. Buddha Palita's commentary on root wisdom. So in chapter 18, right? Gere Pumpo Dakyana, Keranjipur Tower Gyur, Gere Pumpo Namle Shen, Gere Pumpo Namle Shen. Anyway, this the first verse and then the second 2 lines. So it's Gele Pumpo Namle Shen something. Forgetting the last line. So it's if the self is different from the aggregates, then they would be unrelated. So he had, and then the passage by Buddha Palita commenting on that. So then when he woke up, then he had a realization of emptiness, and it said that after that his writing became very different, and most of his texts were composed after that. So when he was 41 up until he was 62 was when he composed most of what we have today. The first thing he composed was Tentril Dupa, the praise for dependent arising, which was detailing his experience, what it was like to realize emptiness. And this is sometimes called Lekshin Ningpo Chungwa, right? Because it's called Lekshin Ningpo. The actual text, if you see the end, it's called Lekshin Ningpo, but then he later wrote Trange Lekshin Ningpo, so that's Lekshin Ningpo Chewa. So after he had this realization of emptiness, then he also wrote 5 texts that are considered his great texts on emptiness. So the first one he wrote was LAM.RIM.CHEN.MO, which is the section of LAM.RIM.CHEN.MO that's on emptiness. It's quite substantial. If we have LAM.RIM.CHEN.MO is about 800 pages. The last 250 pages are on Halakdong, so what did I say? Special insight. So that was the first one, earliest one. And then it was Trange Lekshin Ningpo that I just mentioned. And then came, Rigbe Gyatso, so Semir Gyatso, Ocean of Reasoning, which he composed, I think, when he was 52, is a commentary directly on Nagarjuna's root wisdom. And then I think the last 2, Gombar Abzel and LAM.RIM.CHEN.MO, he composed very close to the end of his life. So I think Gombar Abzel was first. And then that's his commentary on Chandrakirti. That's what we study here. And so when we study Madhyamaka, we study Gombar Abzel. And then he used to compose LAM.RIM.CHEN.MO, right, the middle-length LAM.RIM, which was a bit more refined, but obviously a lot more condensed. And I think that was the last text he composed were those 2, and then Bedung Kunsel, the commentary on Chakra Samvara. So yeah, he really only started composing tantric text in his 50s, but he composed a lot. More than half of his sungbom is on tantra, so it's very very prolific at that point. So anyway, it's a bit of a long introduction, but he was impressed by this presentation of the path by Atisha and this tradition, and by the LAM.RIM.CHEN.MO by Drolungpa. So he wanted to do something similar, but it was much more detailed and easier to read also. And it was one of his students and also his colleague, Kapchok Pelsang, who requested him to compose this text. So yeah, he did that over a couple of years. And I thought I was going to read this a little bit. This is the biography by Thubten Jinpa, there's a little bit about the beginning of the text. There's actually several pages that some of you might want to read, but I just wanted to read the first couple paragraphs of that. So thus, in the fall of 1401, when Tsongkhapa was 44 years old, he began the composition of what would become his most influential work, the great treatise on the stages of the path to enlightenment. At Tsongkhapa's request, the statue of Atisha made by Dromtongpa was brought into his room. Every morning, Tsongkhapa would pray in front of this image and then proceed with his writing. It was also in the presence of this precious statue that Tsongkhapa wrote the prayer to the lineage masters, the sages of the path, a metrical hymn of invocation chanted to this day at the start of every formal teaching on LAM.RIM. So this is the LAM.RIM Soteb, you might know. So we sometimes do that at the beginning of LAM.RIM teachings. We didn't do it today. Maybe we do it next time. I didn't think of that. So for a while, the writing went smoothly, but after Tsongkhapa completed the section on tranquility, right, the Shine, or special insight, and was thinking about writing the final part, the section on the cultivation of insight and the view of emptiness, he began to have qualms. Given the difficult nature of the topic, he wondered if a lengthy exposition of the view of emptiness in this treatise would be of any real benefit to his readers. As he was struggling with this question, he experienced the vision of Manjushri, who urged him to continue with his writing, and assured him that the insight section would be a benefit to his readers. Tsongkhapa therefore made fervent supplications to his meditation deity and to the lineage masters. One day, as he was writing about some of the more challenging aspects of the view of emptiness, he had a vision of the names of the 20 types of emptiness in the form of silver characters standing vertically in the space in front of him, as if they were inscribed on a parchment. Encouraged and inspired, Tsongkhapa finished the final section of the text, and thus in 1402, Tsongkhapa completed his great treatise in just over a year. You can, I think if anyone's interested, you can read the rest of this. But I think it's interesting to see how much, Tsongkhapa had inspiration from these deities and from his practice, because sometimes people say that the Gelong is very intellectual, which it is, but it certainly wasn't that Tsongkhapa was just going through these intellectual deliberations and then writing things down. He was very much a mystic, and very much in his life was this accumulation of merit and very strong devotional practices. It wasn't just meant as an intellectual exercise. Then the other thing I'll talk about is the study of LAM.RIM here at Sera, because sometimes there's this saying that I've heard it, the Western teachers saying that it's better that Western monks don't come to Sera because they don't practice LAM.RIM. It'd be better that we had a LAM.RIM monastery, and we'll start a LAM.RIM monastery. I think there is something to be said for that, in as much as sometimes it does get a little bit divorced from the point of things when we debate so much. And Lama Tsongkhapa always was very good about encouraging his students to integrate practice and not just to study. But also, it could be that there's a bit of a misunderstanding of how the study functions here. Usually the understanding in the monastery, it said that you shouldn't really read the LAM.RIM.CHEN.MO until you finish the studies, because all it is taking all the things you studied and then putting it into a practical way of how to practice it. And you'll find that as you go through the studies, maybe not the first few years, but when you get especially to lectures year and onwards, you can read the LAM.RIM.CHEN.MO along with what you're studying, and it's very much related to what you are studying. So like when we studied Semke and Enji, so Bodhicitta and Four Noble Truths, I read the sections of LAM.RIM.CHEN.MO, and it's very much a good complement to what you're studying, but you see also that it's limited, that if you read, there's a lot more to it, and so that's why we study, in Parchen, we study these things. And especially with Loktong Chenmo, I actually think, so the last part on special insight, I think it's not very useful probably to read it before you study Uma, because you have no idea what the context is for what they're talking about, or what he's talking about. It could be good just to get some imprints, and I was fortunate when I was 21, 20, I think, just before I turned 21. Lama Tsongkhapa actually told me to come Wisconsin, where Geshe Zopa was teaching. He had been giving this long, actually it wasn't Lama Tsongkhapa, it was Gombar Absel, but similar on emptiness. He'd been giving over many years his commentary on Gombar Absel. And so Rinpoche said, come for a month and just listen. And I didn't obviously follow a whole lot of it because it's quite advanced, a lot of terms I didn't know, but it was very nice to have the imprint, and I'm very fortunate to have met Geshe Zopa, I think one of the most extraordinary teachers. As many of you know, was Lama Geshe's main teacher. So there's definitely benefit in that, and just getting that exposure. But in terms of really understanding it, then it's very hard to understand what it's talking about unless you study Uma first and debate it. But the other parts of the text, they're very practical, and so you don't necessarily have to study it a lot. You'll get more out of it if you study. And so in terms of, well, should you finish the program first and then read it, I think, that's a bit extreme also. But it's actually quite good to read it before and have a right motivation for doing the program. You don't want it just to be a matter of I'll debate things, and if it makes sense, I'll stay, and if not, then I'll go somewhere else. It should be some sense of there's a purpose for being here and generating some degree of renunciation and bodhicitta. And also, of course, we have the teachings from Ken Rinpoche. The abbot will give teachings regularly on Lam.RIM, although it's a bit spread out, and especially maybe for the foreigners, it's hard to understand what he's saying. So it's good to have it separately here. So that's a very long introduction, but it's the first day. It's good to do that. I think, and also there's another accusation that's sometimes made. And this is very, very different from the accusation of Westerners that we don't study Lam.RIM here. There's accusations from people in other schools of Tibetan Buddhism that the Lam.RIM is too codified, that realization doesn't happen in this stepwise manner, which may be true. Just I think it's not like you just have this realization, then this one, and it just happens in exactly how it's outlined in the text. But it's very helpful as a way of just thinking about these things, thinking about it in an organized way. Because really what the Lam.RIM is just condensing the teachings of the Buddha. It's not like Tsongkhapa was making new things up. And as you'll see as we go through the text, he's constantly quoting all of the sutras that are the source for what he's saying. But if you read the teachings of the Buddha, if you read, for example, the Pali Canon, then it's not really in any particular order. If you read the Tibetan Kangyur, it's even harder to put it together. It's all these volumes of text that a lot of it just doesn't, you have no idea what the context is for what's being talked about. And then, as I said, if you read the Indian text, it's not a whole lot different. A lot of Indian texts it's very hard to place them and to understand why they're talking about this, and they're not written to be easily understood. It seems that there was it was a bit of a thing in India that if you were a scholar, you had to write in a specific way that impressed the other scholars, that you knew how to write in a scholarly way. If you just wrote in a colloquial manner that ordinary people could understand, people wouldn't take you seriously. It's not easy to see how to put these things into practice immediately, but this makes it very clear. And so, as long as you don't expect that it's going to be exactly how it is in the text and get very attached to that and get a bit dogmatic about it, then it's very helpful to have it all in this way, and then you can memorize the outlines. Some of you, I think most of you have the book that Kidger printed, right? There's that's not the LAM.RIM.CHEN.MO outlines, but it has a lot of the similar thing. That's Nirlam and Delong. So then if you have that, you can think about these things and become very familiar with it. So I thought we'd start with LAM.RIM.CHEN.MO. We could start with one of the shorter texts. But personally, I find the LAM.RIM.CHEN.MO very accessible. It's not like it's so difficult, it's just longer. But personally, from my own reading, I've read a lot of them, and I just find it's more effective for my mind to read LAM.RIM.CHEN.MO than anything else. Even though some of the other ones are also very helpful, and but it's going to take a while. Maybe it won't finish, but it's good to start with it. So anyway, we can start going through the text. And I brought the English because, for the most part, I don't think I'll have any trouble reading the text part. But sometimes when he quotes when Tsongkhapa quotes the kata masters and so forth, then it's very hard to understand, because Tsongkhapa's writing in literary Tibetan, which has not changed a great deal from then till now, fortunately. So if you studied in Chura, in Tibet, then it's not that hard to understand. But the colloquial language is obviously quite different, because you read these texts, these quotations by the kata masters, and it just doesn't line up with anything you've heard. So in that case, I might occasionally have to look over in the English. So here, this is the title of the text, right? I have some notes here, because we've had the fortune, as I said, over the years to receive this from various abbots, and so I've made notes of things they said. So Nyame Tsongkhapa Chenpo Zepe Jondut LAM.RIM.CHEN.MO. So Nyame is peerless or unequaled. So Khyentse Rinpoche, the current abbot, actually, Gache Tashi Sera, he says there's 15 ways in which Tsongkhapa is unequaled, such as hearing and contemplation, composition and exposition, and etc. He didn't go through all 15. And then we have Tsongkhapa. So Tsongkha, it's a region in Amdo, where he was from. So there's now the monastery Kumbum there, which was built where he was said to have been born. But the word Kumbum means 1,000 images, 100,000 images, because there was a statue, there's a tree, supposedly, that sprouted up where his mother had given birth to him, and then the tree would then sprout, and the leaves, it would sprout little statues of the Buddhas. And actually, there's documentation of this by a couple of Christian missionaries from the 18th century who went and saw this, and they were quite, what's the word, miffed by it? Well, miffed in the sense of, like, they were trying to convert the Tibetans, and they weren't looking for miracles from the Tibetan side. They were trying to convince them of the teachings of Christianity. But anyway, they were very honest people, so they recorded what they saw. So it's interesting if you have a chance to read that. It's maybe more convincing than just reading the Tibetan account. Anyway, so Tsongkha, the Tsong is onion, right? So Khyentse Rinpoche said it either means the onion land, or it could imply that it's a place where people buy and sell a lot. Tsongkha. In any case, Tibetans don't usually call him Tsongkhapa, right? We say Khyentse Rinpoche. But in the West, for whatever reason, he's become generally known by the name Tsongkhapa. So Tsongkhapa Chenpo Zepe Jondut LAM.RIM.CHEN.MO. So Chewa, it's as opposed to the other shorter ones. And it's both the subject matter and the words are more extensive. So Chewa. Okay, so you have the first, you see Chuju, the expression of homage, right? You all found it? Namo Guru Manju Gochaya. Yeah. So it starts with, this is a common thing, to have the text start with a Sanskrit, because it's supposed to make a connection with the language, the Sanskrit language, and to show that there was a pure source for the text. And also just in terms of the following after the style of the translators who translated all the Indian text, they would always start with the Indian title. So Namo, Chaksawa, and Guru Mandra Goshaya. So what do we have here? Dripni Subraktandrawa. So Mandru is smooth, and said that's because free of the roughness, the coarseness of the two obscurations. And then Gosha is melodious. So this is referring to the qualities of speech, the 60 qualities of speech. So Punso Gelek Chewe Trumpe Ku. So this is the prostration to the Buddha for body, speech, and mind, right? So Punso Gelek Chewe. So 10 million virtues and goodness, great virtues of goodness. Your body is composed of those, Trunpa. And Taye Drowe Rewa Konwai Song. So your speech fulfills the wishes of limitless beings. Malu Shecha Dijin Zikpe Tok. So your mind sees as they are the countless all phenomena without exception. Shakyet So de la Gochak Sel. So I prostrate with the crown of my head to the principle of the Shakyas. Sindame Tumba de Hiseki Chok. So the supreme of the sons of that peerless teacher. Yewe Zepa Kungi Kornamne. So who took upon himself the load, to carry the load of the activities of that victor. Trame Shingdu. Actually, you could take it, and not the Gyewa could just be a general. Right? It could refer to Buddha himself, or it could just say that to enact the deeds of a victor in a general sense. Trame Shingdu Trulwe Namrulba. So emanation or play play of emanations in countless fields. Mipam Jambe Yamachaksela. So these are the two principal sons in terms of the Mahayana lineage, which is Maitreya, Mipam, Ajita, and Jambayam, Manjushri. And then Shindu Papakawa Gyewe Yum. So the Yum here is the mother is talking probably most about the text, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. Or you could take it as the understanding of emptiness, or the mind of the Buddha. Those are all understood as Yum. So Shindu Paparakawa, very difficult to fathom the depths of it, to understand it. Jijin Gomba Drilze Zamlingyan. So the ornament of the world, who explain the meaning of that, explain the intention of that. And then Ludrup Tokme Chini Sasana. So those who are called Ludrup and Tokme, Nagarjuna and Asanga, in Sasana. So in the three worlds, Yongtsu Drakpa. So they're renowned in the three worlds. Yongtsu Drape Jabla Dakchak. So I prostrate to their feet. So we have here again note from the abbot. Ludrup, right? So who achieves Nagas, because he has the similar power to a powerful Naga. And because he is endowed with the richness or the heaviness of being endowed with the knowledge of the great texts. And then Tokme, right? So without obstacle. So Yiga Chudzin, Tokme du, Dro. Oh yeah, okay. So he went without obstacle or without obstruction to Yiga Chudzin, to Ganden. So when he flew into the sky with Maitreya, there was no obstructions. That's why he's called Asanga. Shingda Chenpo ni Lele Gyupe. So from those two, the two great trailblazers, meaning Anagarjuna and Asanga, then the continuing lineage. Zamo Tawa Sabjin Jupe Lam. So the two, the profound view and the extensive path of the deeds. Manr Yonsu Zube Nedupe. So condensing all of the great points of that without unmistakenly. Dampe Zudzin, so the one who holds the treasure of instruction. Marmed Zeladu. So Marmed Ze is Dipamkara, right? So this is Atisha, Dipamkara Srijana. So right? I bow to Atisha. Rabjam Sungra Kuna Tawe Mi. So the billions or countless teachings, the eye that sees them, the eye that looks at them. In this sense, it's talking about the LAM.RIM teachings. Kyelzan Tarpa Drupe Drugongchok. So the supreme entryway or port of entry for traversing to the path of liberation for the fortunate ones. Sewi Kyupe, so moved by great compassion or by affection. Sewi Kyupe Tapke Zepayi, so in enacting great skill and means. Selze Shinian Amlaguchak cells. So I prostrate respectfully to all of the clarifying lamas or clarifying teachers. Shinyan. So Tengdu, Naljur, Sonam, Tupanyong. So in these days, those who make great effort in Naljur, meaning in accomplishment or practice, they don't have a lot of hearing. They don't have a lot of study. Mongtu Nyamlin Nela Mikejing. And the ones who do hear a lot, then they're not skilled in the points of how to practice it. So Pelcher Sungrap Tala Chokre Mi. So yeah, in terms of looking at the teachings, Chokre Mi. So they have a one-sided eye. Chokre is like it's like partial or biased. No, it's not quite biased, but it's like it's only partial. So you only look at part of the things. Lungdon Rikpe Chepe Tumepe. So they don't have the power to open the meaning of the text with wisdom, with reasoning. Tempe Nenam Zope Dampachok. So the supreme teaching that is a supreme complete teaching that of the point all the points of the teachings. Yeah, Dampa and Dempa are both the teachings, but Dampa you could say is more like instruction. It's more like personal instruction, whereas Dempa is more the general teachings of the Buddha. So Kepe Gepe Lam Tang Drel Tong Ne. So seeing that everyone is divorced or not with the path that pleases scholars or pleases masters. Shinda Chempo Lamdi Shepala. So in order to explain this path of the great trailblazers, Dagi Hini Kundu Trowargir. So my mind became moved by great joy to do so. Gangdak Chugzin Mube Madribla. So those who are not obscured by the darkness of holding to a particular side, of being biased. Lekne Chepe Lui Tudenching, and who have the eye, or endowed with the mind, the power of mind to discriminate what is good and what is bad. Dele Denzang Dunden Chidupe, so the wish to make meaningful this life of liberty and endowments, this basis, human basis. So such fortunate ones, please single-mindedly focus and listen. Okay, so then Dampa, the preliminaries to the teaching of the instruction. Dear Gawe Sungap Tamchigi Ne Dupa. So in condensing all the points of the teachings of the Buddha, Shingda Chempo Ludruptang Tob Me Niki Lam So. So the path. They say the tradition of the path of the two great trailblazers, Nagarjuna and Asanga. Nampa Tamche Kiempe Sar. So going to the ground of the all-knowing, Drowe Kyo Chugi Chulok. So the tradition, the Dharma tradition of the great beings who went to that, who progressed to that ground. Kebo Sungi Nyamsu Lampe Rimpa Tamche. So that's important, that the three beings, right? Three capable beings. This was, I think, first started, this idea by Atisha in the LAM.RIM, the lamp of the path, the idea of the three capable beings, which is the central point of the LAM.RIM, how to organize the teachings. Kebu Sungi Nyamsu Lampe Rimpa, so all their stages of the practice. Tamche Matsa or Meper Dupa, so without leaving anything out or without being incomplete, all condensed together. Janjit Lamgi Udimpe Gone, so through the stages of the path. Kelpadang Dempa, so the ones with fortune. Sangigi Sar Tripe Tulni, so the manner of leading to the state of a Buddha. Dang Sheper Chawe Chuzo, that is what I'm going to explain. Dela Pel Nalande Kepa Namni, so all the great scholars of Nalanda, Lopagi, they've had these three ways of approaching the teachings, or explaining the teachings. Lopagi Ngak Dakpatang, so there's the pure teaching, the pure speech of the teacher. And Lopme Gyu Dakpa, the pure continuum of the disciples. And a Sheche Chu Dakpa, and the teaching that is to be explained is pure. So Dakpa Sum, the three purities. Dabba Sumgi Gone Chu Jeper Jela, so they understood it that way. Du Chini, so in later times in Vikramashila. So we had Nalanda, which was probably the first major monastic university, and then Vikramashila, which was later, which was where Atisha was from Vikramashila. Some of you know, probably most of you have been to Nalanda. If you haven't, very good to visit Nalanda. It's not very far from Bodh Gaya. They discovered the ruins in the 1860s. There was a British, I think Alexander Cunningham. I don't know if he discovered it, but someone else probably found it, but he came and helped excavate it, I think. They didn't know what it was at first, but then somebody put two and two together, he'd say, and they'd heard of this great Indian university from ancient times, and somebody said maybe this is Nalanda, but it took them quite a while to figure out that's what it was. And then Vikramasila, as of 1920s, we have a very good book in the library about Nalanda and the history of the excavation of it, but it was written in the 1930s, I think, so it's a bit outdated maybe. But yeah, he says that they never found Vikramasila, but I think subsequently they have in Uttar Pradesh. But then the third one, Adantapuri, the other major one, they never found, I don't think. Not yet. So anyway, Du Chini Vikramasila Tempar Dawe, so the teaching spread there. De Kepanamni, so those scholars, Chut Tsongkhapa Chewa, so they have the three greatnesses, right? So the Chut Tsongkhapa Chewa, so the composer of the teaching is great. Chugi Chewa, the teaching is great. And Jidar Sheijing, Nyempetsu, Sum Den Sum. So then the way of teaching and the way of listening. Ngundu Gil Chewa Shipe. So they in the beginning, before starting, those are considered very important. Gache Tsu Suni Jungwar Drapale. So Shepetsu, so this is what he's saying, is that in Nalanda they talked about it in terms of these three purities. That's how they approach the teachings. And in Vikramasila, they talked about it in terms of the three greatnesses. But it's sort of similar. It's just a different way of saying it. So Jungwa Drapale, so it's renowned that way. Virni, so here it's Vikramasila because it's a teacher system. So Chimatar Shepachao, we explain in terms of the latter system. Tetar na Janjab Lam Gyudim by Trilashi. So the teachings on the sages of the path is 4 divisions. So Chu Kong Sumpar Dembe Chir. So to show that the source of the teaching is noble. Zepapo Chewa Dempa. So explaining the greatness of the teacher. And then Damngak Gyubar Kewe Chir. So in order to generate respect for the instruction, Chugi Chewa Dempa, explaining the greatness of the teaching. And then Chewa Ni Tan Dempe Chula. So then the Dharma that's endowed with those two greatnesses, Nyenshe Didar Chewa. So how do the way of listening and teaching it. Dampa Ngugi Loma Jidar Rimpa. So then through the actual instruction, the way of guiding the disciples. So Dambo Zepapon here. It's the first, the instructor, which is actually Atisha in this case. It's talking about the LAM.RIM teachings from Atisha. Damngak Di Chir Jetsun Jampe Zepe Ngumpodobe Gengi Damngak Gima. So generally speaking, these instructions are the instructions of Maitreya in the Abhisama Lamkara. Kepar du Di Jungni Jandal Lamgi Drunme Yinpe. So that, but the main, specifically in this context, it's based on how it was codified in Atisha's text, the length of the path. But the point, of course, this is as we were discussing before, is that it's based on the Abhisamaya Lamkara. So if we say that we don't study the LAM.RIM at Sera, well, we're studying the Abhisamaya Lamkara. So in that sense, we are studying LAM.RIM, but it's just a more extensive way. It's said that the LAM.RIM teachings are kind of how do you say, not based, but have the source for Atisha's way of codifying this is in chapter 6 of Abhisamaya Lamkara, the Targi Rimpa, Targi Jorwa, because the chapter 6 is only one verse, and it's only about 3 pages in the Chidan. But the point of chapter 6 is to say, hey, this is how you put this in a particular order and practice it in order. So it's understood that is the source for Atisha's understanding of this. So he's also the author of that text. Teang Lobon.CHEN.MO, so the great teacher being Atisha, Vikrama Shilar Zana Sen Shen Pelden Atisha. Right, so sorry. Deepa, that's not Vikrama Shila. Deepamkara Srijana. Yeah, his name, his Sanskrit name, is Deepamkara Srijana. So then his other name is Pelden Atisha. Right, is known as the great Atisha, the glorious Atisha. Of course, in Tibetan, it's Joje, right? Tibetans say Joje. I remember when I was teaching Rinpoche for a while, English, I was over there at the LAM.RIM, and I was trying to tell him about Atisha, and I was surprised. He don't know who Atisha is. So I called his Gen over. I was like, I'm trying to tell him who Atisha is. He said, who's Atisha? And then I said, Joje. Oh, yeah, Joje. I guess maybe they didn't get my pronunciation or something, because they probably would know the word Atisha, but they don't. It's not. It's like I said with Tsongkhapa. They say Rinpoche. They Joje. Atisha. You also drop a de. De che will assume. So the greatness is in terms of three ways. So Rik Ponson Sobra Kewa Jebetsul. So the way he was born into a noble lineage. Den Dela, so Den means in that life, right? Den Dela Yun the Nebetsul, the way he found great qualities in that life. Nyene Tempala Chawar Zepetsul, so after he'd found them, then how he enacted deeds for the teachings. Damboni, so first of all, Yonde Nip Lot Sawa Chempo Naxo Zepe Topa Gechu Pale. So there's an 80 verse praise of Atisha by Naxo Lotsawa. Naxo was actually a contemporary of Atisha. He met him, I think, in India. There's a story of Naxo when he met Naropa. It's a very interesting story of him meeting Naropa, because we don't get a lot of really historically verifiable accounts of these things, but this was considered by historians anyways, considered one of the most accurate, most reliable, or what's the word? When you have history and you're fairly certain that it's actually verifiable or something we can take as real history. When Natso Lotsawa went to see Naropa, I think he was seeing Atisha at Vikrama, because that's what it was. The Naxo and some others, they were learning Sanskrit, and there's a story of Atisha coming out when they were reciting the Heart Sutra, and just commenting on the way they were reciting it. But anyway, they'd heard that Naropa was nearby, not in the monastery anymore, but he was living out in the somewhere in the fields or something with his tantric disciples. So they went to see him, and there's a story of how he was just wearing a loincloth, and his hair was very long and dyed with ochre. It was orange. So yeah, definitely. How do you say what's the word? The typical view of a tantra guru. But it seems Atisha was very really praised of Naropa himself. He was, Atisha was much more of the traditional strict monk. He was very positive about what Naropa was doing. Anyway, so Natso Lotsawa, he also, just another note about him, he translated Umala Jupa, right, Amadhyamaka Patara. But it didn't get much recognition at the time, and then later Patsap translated it. And because, for political reasons, they say, then the Patsap translation became very well accepted and widespread. So now we use Patsap Lotsawa's translation, but when you read Gompo Gobarabsel, Tsongkhapa's commentary, sometimes he'll quote Naxo's translation and say it's actually more clear. So sometimes, some certain verses especially, he says that this is more understandable if you read Naxo. So anyway, he wrote this 80-verse praise of Atisha. So Sharjok Sahur Yulchok Na. So in the east, in the land of Sahur, Yulchok Na Dena Tronkir Chempoyu. There's a great city, Vikramani Pura Yin. So that's the name of the city, Vikramani Pura. Dehi Una Gyapokap. So in the center of that is the king's needle, which means like the capital, right? Literally. Usually when we say Gyalpo Kop, we talk about this Rajagriha. Right? That's what Rajagriha is a city, but this is maybe he is talking about it. Maybe he was in Magad, right? It was the capital of Magad Empire. So Podrang Shindu Yampayo. So there was a very expensive palace there. Sergi Gelson Shencheja, it was called the Golden Victory Banner. Longchu Ngatang Jorwani. So and as for how it was endowed with all these great resources or wealth, Gyanap Tongtun Gyapodra. So it was like the king of the emperor of China, Tongkun, one of the Tang emperors, I think. Maybe Song. Probably Song at that time. Yulde Gyeobu Gyewe Pel. So the king of that country was named Gyewe Pel. So glory of virtue. Sunmo Pelmo Ozirchen. So the queen was named Pelmo Ozir. So the glorious light rays. Yabyum Nile Nyamyu Nila Se Sun Nga. So they had 3 children or 3 sons. Pe Me Ning Tan Dawe Ning. So the first one was named Lotus Essence. The second one was named Moon Essence. And then Pelgi Ningpo. So then glorious essence. Shichao Gilbu Pe Me Ningpo La. So as for the first one, this the prince Lotus Essence. Sunmo Nga Yu Seni Gu. So he had 5 queens and 7 children. I guess they weren't very successful in having children. Segi Tupo Sonam Pel. So there's the heart son was named Sonam Pel, the glorious merit. Tande Duna Kepache. So at that time he was a great scholar. Dhanashri Shechawadra, so he was called Dhanashri. There was a scholar, basically. There was a scholar named Dhanashri, a great scholar. Chinwa Pelgi Ningpuni. So then for the younger son, who was named Glorious Essence, Gelong, Vikra, Sandrian, Vikra Chandra. Vira Chandra, right? So that would be Pao Dao, I think. Pao Dao is in Tibetan. Dringpo Dawe Ningponi. So then the middle son was the moon essence. Tanda Lama Jitsunin. So that's the Lama we're talking about now. That's Atisha. She Jumwataro. Okay. So yeah, we got through a page or so. Well, maybe 2 pages. So maybe if anyone has any questions, and then otherwise we do the closing prayers. But I want to leave a little time in case there's any questions. Yeah.
This is a very good thing, and I hope that this is at all interesting for anyone. But
yeah.
I think it's in the edition I have here. It doesn't say Vira; it says Virya.
Virya. Oh, Virya. Yeah. So Sundru. Sundru.
Yeah.
Sundru. Okay.
So
yeah. Actually, Gennam Gyalchipil, he told me if I come, he'll teach me how to read the Sanskrit. The phonetics of Sanskrit in Tibetan is quite difficult.
Yeah.
So he said, I was thinking I should go there sometime and do that. But
I have a question.
Difficult, yeah.
Atisha, he's from Greek Ramal Shiva.
Yeah.
He's part of the 17 Ananda prayer, so why is that?
I think because it's sort of a general thing. The great Indian scholars, it's not certain if all of them were at Nalanda. I mean, there's a lot of question of whether Nagarjuna himself was at Nalanda. I think in that book we have on the history of Nalanda, I mean, it's pretty clear that Nalanda, as a functioning monastery that was sponsored by the king, was not really active until the 4th, 5th century. So Nagarjuna would have been there quite before that, but he does, even this is a historian saying, he does concede that it's quite possible he was there at Nalanda, the place Nalanda, because even the Buddha taught there, and that it later became this extensive monastery, but he was there. But yeah, in terms of Atisha, I think His Holiness added in there, and I think it's just because he is, he's one of the great scholars who came to Tibet, and so we always debate things, right? So it's like like mainly they're from Nalanda, or Chi Ming Chedak, but Chedak Ming Chedak Chiladapa or something like that. Yeah, okay. Yeah, and actually I should say Bengal. He was from Bengal, as it's usually said, but I guess Magad in ancient times probably included Bengal. It was mainly in Bihar, but No, but I'm thinking, because it says here Gyalpo Kap. Rajagriha is definitely in present-day Bihar, but we say that Atisha was from Bengal, so yeah, maybe it's a different Gyalpo Kap. You can look in here, it's probably more clear in the English. Okay. No other questions? Finish.
Alright, so the last two pages. From my two collections,
vast is space that I amass, working with effort this practice for a great length of time, become the chief leading Buddha for all those whose minds' wisdom eye is blinded by ignorance. Even if I don't reach this state, may I be held in your loving compassion for all my life, Manjushri. May I find the best of complete great paths, the teachings, and may I please all the Buddhas by my practice. Using skillful means, drawn by the strong force of compassion, clear the darkness from the minds of all beings, the points of the path as I have discerned them. Hold the Buddha's teachings for a very long time. With my heart going out with great compassion in whatever direction the most precious teachings have not yet spread or once spread have declined, reveal this treasure of happiness and aid.
May the hearts of those who wish for liberation grant upon you peace. And
as the needs be nourished for a long time, in this graded path to enlightenment completed due to the wondrous, virtuous conduct of the Buddhas and their sons. Human and the human beings who eliminate diversity and create conditions for practicing the excellent paths,
never departed from any part of their lives, the
purest path praised by the Buddha, whenever someone makes an effort to act in accordance with the tenfold virtuous practices, may he always be assisted by the mighty ones, the oceans of prosperity spread everywhere.